Viewer discretion is advised. This video discusses real crimes, disturbing historical events, and elements that some viewers may find deeply unsettling. The subject matter may not be suitable for all audiences. You have been warned. Think about the horror films that truly scare you. Not the ones that made you flinch at a loud noise or a sudden cut. I mean the ones that stayed with you afterward. The ones that followed you home and sat quietly in the corner of the room while you tried to sleep. The ones that made you hesitate just for a second before reaching into a dark hallway to find the light switch. For millions of people around the world, one film sits at the very top of that list: the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. A film so raw, so relentless, and so deeply uncomfortable that audiences who saw it for the first time in 1974 walked out of theaters genuinely unsure whether what they had just watched was real. At the center of that film stood one of the most terrifying characters ever put on screen. Leatherface, a massive, lumbering figure, silent, unstoppable, and wearing a mask. Not a Halloween costume, not a rubber prop from a costume shop, a mask made from human skin. That image burned itself into the cultural memory of an entire generation. But here is the thing most people never stop to ask. Where did that idea come from? Not from a screenwriter's imagination, not from a director trying to push the limits of what audiences could tolerate. From a real person, a quiet, soft-spoken man from a small farming town in the state of Wisconsin. A man who kept to himself, a man his neighbors described as polite, a man whose farmhouse, when police finally stepped inside in 1957, revealed something so far beyond what anyone had prepared for that investigators reportedly stood in the darkness and could not speak. His name was Ed Gein, and when police searched his house, they found bowls made from human skulls, furniture made from bones, and a suit made entirely from human skin. The truth behind what happened inside that farmhouse would not only shock the entire country, it would go on to inspire some of the most terrifying characters ever created in the history of horror. But the story of how it got that far is even more disturbing. Because what investigators uncovered inside that house had not appeared overnight. It had been building quietly for years. So before we return to that farmhouse, let me take you back to where this story really begins. A quiet town where nothing like this was ever supposed to happen. Plainfield, Wisconsin in the 1950s was the kind of town that no one outside the state had ever heard of. And the people who lived there liked it that way. It was a small rural community surrounded by flat farmland and dense forest. The kind of place where the roads go quiet after dark and the only sounds at night are the wind through the trees and the occasional bark of a dog down the road. Serious crime was almost unheard of. People left their doors unlocked. Life in Plainfield moved slowly, and that was exactly how the people who lived there wanted it. Nothing that would make a stranger slow down, look twice, and feel that quiet, crawling sense that something was not quite right. Including the farmhouse just outside town, including the man who lived inside it. Ed Gein. Odd fellow, people said, kept to himself since his mother passed, would sometimes babysit for families in town, harmless. Just a lonely man living alone on an old farm. No one looked any closer than that. No one needed to. Not until November of 1957. On the morning of November 16th, 1957, Bernice Worden opened the doors of her hardware store the same way she did every single morning. She was 58 years old. She had run that store for years and was well known and well liked throughout Plainfield. Her son, Frank Worden, happened to be the county sheriff. The morning passed without incident. Customers came and went. Business was ordinary. But as the afternoon wore on, something shifted. A customer arrived at the store and found it empty. The door was unlocked, but no one was inside. The cash register had been pulled open, and on the floor there were traces of something that stopped them where they stood. Something that had no business being there. Something dark. Blood. Not a large amount, but enough. When word reached Frank Worden, he moved quickly. Investigators began pulling the register records to trace the last transactions of the day. And there on the most recent receipt was a record of a purchase. Antifreeze. The name associated with that sale was Ed Gein. That evening, deputies drove out to the old Gein farmhouse just outside town. They were not sure what they expected to find. Perhaps a confused old man with a strange explanation. Perhaps nothing at all. What they actually found would follow every single one of them for the rest of their lives. When officers arrived at the Gein property, it was already growing dark. The farmhouse sat back from the road, surrounded by overgrown land. It was the kind of place that looks abandoned until you get close enough to realize it is not. Deputies spread out and began searching the property. In a shed just behind the main house, they found Bernice Worden. I will not describe what they found in detail, but I will tell you this. She had not survived. The discovery of Bernice Worden should have been the worst thing about that night. It was not. As investigators moved from the shed into the farmhouse itself, they began to understand that they were not dealing with an ordinary crime scene. The house was dark inside, deeply cluttered. There was barely room to move through some of the rooms. Stacks of old magazines and newspapers were piled against the walls. Junk covered nearly every surface. At first glance, it might have looked like the home of someone who simply never threw anything away. But as investigators moved deeper into the house, they noticed something that made the scene even stranger. Nearly every room in the farmhouse was filthy, except for one room that looked completely untouched. The bed was neatly made. The furniture was perfectly arranged. The room was clean, almost sacred. Investigators quickly realized what they were looking at. It was Augusta Gein's bedroom. Ed had sealed it off after her death and left it exactly the way it had been when she was alive. While the rest of the house slowly collapsed into chaos, that room remained frozen in time. And the deeper investigators moved into the farmhouse, the more disturbing the discoveries became. Objects that did not belong in any home, things that made no sense, things that grew more unsettling with every step they took. And then, somewhere deeper inside that house, one of the investigators found something else entirely. Something carefully stored away. Something Ed Gein had apparently spent a great deal of time putting together. We will get to what that was, because understanding it requires understanding the full picture of what Ed Gein had been doing inside that house, and why. And that story begins long before November of 1957. It begins with his mother. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin, the second of two sons. His father struggled with alcohol and held little authority over family life. The authority in that house belonged entirely to Ed's mother. Her name was Augusta. Augusta Gein was a deeply religious woman with rigid, uncompromising beliefs. The world outside their farm was sinful and corrupt. Women were instruments of immorality. The outside world was contaminated. The only safe place was the farm itself. She moved the family to Plainfield when Ed was still a young child and cut her sons off from the outside world completely. No friendships, no socializing. They worked the farm, attended church, and listened to Augusta read from the Bible. Passages about death, about sin, about the wages of a corrupt and fallen world. Ed was quiet, gentle, and deeply sensitive. Exactly the kind of child who needed warmth and connection. Augusta gave him neither. What she gave him instead was control. Total and absolute control. She was the one constant in his world. The one person who was always there. And over the years, as the isolation deepened, that dependence curled into something that would not reveal its true shape until much later. As Ed moved into adulthood, the small world he had grown up in began to fall apart. His father died in 1940. He had never been a significant presence, and his absence changed very little. But then came something that did change things. In 1944, Ed's older brother Henry died. He and Ed had been clearing brush on their property when a fire broke out. When the flames were brought under control, Henry was found dead. His death was ruled accidental suffocation, but investigators noted something they could not explain away. Henry's body had been found face down, in an area the fire had never touched. Nothing was ever proven, but that detail has never fully gone away. Ed Gein was now alone with his mother. It would not last. In late 1945, Augusta suffered a series of strokes. Ed cared for her with total devotion. And then, in December of 1945, Augusta died. She was gone. And with her, every anchor Ed Gein had ever had to the world outside his own mind disappeared. The grief that followed was not ordinary grief. It was something that did not fade the way grief is supposed to. He sealed off her bedroom and sitting room, leaving them exactly as they had been. He stopped maintaining the property. He retreated further into himself. Neighbors noticed. He seemed more distant, harder to read, but no one was alarmed. He was just Ed. Strange, quiet, harmless Ed, living alone out on the farm. What he was doing at night, no one knew. After Augusta's death, Ed Gein began reading, voraciously and obsessively, medical texts, anatomy books, accounts of strange practices from distant corners of the world. He developed a fascination that fed something already growing darker inside him. And then at some point in the late 1940s, the reading was no longer enough. Ed Gein began visiting the local cemeteries at night. He did not go to grieve. He went with tools. He was methodical. He would read the obituaries in the local newspaper, scanning for names, for burial dates, women who had died recently, women who reminded him of his mother. And then, when enough time had passed, he would wait for a night with no moon. And he would go, and he would dig. What he took from those graves he brought back to the farmhouse, back to those dark, cluttered rooms, where he used them to create the objects that police would eventually find inside. Bowls fashioned from human skulls, furniture constructed from human bones, lampshades covered in preserved human skin, human faces carefully removed and stretched, stored like masks. Many of the remains were later traced to graves in the Plainfield area. Women who had been buried and grieved for by their families. Families who had no idea what had been happening to their loved ones after they were laid to rest. And no idea about the one thing investigators had not yet fully understood. The thing Ed Gein had been building. The thing that would define how the world came to understand what he truly was. Now let us go back to that farmhouse. Back to November 16th, 1957. Back to those investigators moving through the darkness with their flashlights, trying to make sense of what they were looking at. We have already talked about what they found. The remains, the objects made from human bone and human skin, the evidence of years of secret, terrible activity carried out inside those walls. But there is something I held back, something I told you about at the very beginning of this video. That one discovery, the thing that disturbed investigators more than anything else they found that night. As officers searched deeper into the farmhouse, they came across a collection of items that appeared to have been carefully stored away, not discarded, not left carelessly around the house the way some of the other objects had been. These had been kept, set aside, as if they were precious. And among those items, investigators found something that stopped them cold. A suit, made entirely from human skin, not a prop, not something symbolic. A wearable garment, carefully assembled, painstakingly constructed over a long period of time, intended to be put on. When Ed Gein was later questioned about it, he did not deny it. He explained it in the same quiet, unhurried tone he used throughout his questioning. The same tone someone might use to describe a hobby, a project they had been working on. He had been making it, he said, so that he could wear it. So that by putting it on, he could become his mother. He wanted to inhabit her, to feel, even briefly, like she had never left. The woman who had shaped everything he believed about the world, the woman whose death had taken everything with it. He did not describe this as disturbing. He described it as something he simply needed to do. And that, perhaps more than anything else in this story, is what makes the case of Ed Gein so deeply and enduringly unsettling. Not just what he did, but why. Imagine being one of the investigators who walked into that farmhouse on that November night in 1957, stepping into that darkness with no idea of what was waiting for you inside. No training prepares you for something like that. You are simply there, moving through a strange and cluttered house, and with every step you take, the world becomes a little more wrong. What do you think would be the most disturbing thing to discover in a place like that? Not just the objects, the feeling, the realization of what it all means. Drop the word farmhouse in the comments below, and while you are there, tell me your answer, because I think what truly frightens people says something interesting about who we are. And if you are finding this documentary compelling, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps this small channel more than you know. and there are many more stories like this one still to come. Now let us continue, because the story of Ed Gein does not end with the farmhouse. Ed Gein was taken into custody on the night of the discovery. He was brought in for questioning, and what happened in that room gave investigators a new and deeply uncomfortable layer to the whole story. He was not aggressive. He was not defensive. He did not rage or deny or try to construct some elaborate story to explain away what they had found. He sat across from investigators and he talked, calmly, politely, in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who had nothing to hide and nowhere else to be. He confirmed what investigators suspected about the cemetery visits. He confirmed the grave robberies. He confirmed what he had brought back to the farmhouse and what he had done with those materials once he was home. He confirmed the killing of Bernice Worden, and he confirmed another disappearance that had been troubling the community for years, a woman named Mary Hogan. Mary Hogan had been the owner of a local tavern in the town of Pine Grove. She had vanished in December of 1954. No body had ever been found. No one had ever been charged. For 3 years, her disappearance had simply remained an open question that no one had been able to answer. Ed Gein answered it, just as calmly as he answered everything else. The investigators in that room had been trained to deal with criminals, with people who lied, deflected, performed remorse, performed innocence. They had encountered most of what criminal behavior could look like, but they had never encountered this. A man who appeared to feel genuinely puzzled about why his actions warranted such concern. A man who spoke about deeply disturbing things with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting their daily routine. That quality, more than anything else about Ed Gein, is what stayed with the people who questioned him. Not the anger they expected, the absence of it. Psychiatrists who examined Ed Gein quickly concluded he was not mentally competent to stand trial. He had told them himself what he had done. The question was simply whether his mental state allowed him to participate in his own defense. It did not. He was ruled legally insane and committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Wisconsin. He spent more than a decade there before being deemed competent. In 1968, he was finally tried for the murder of Bernice Worden, found guilty. But the verdict of insanity was upheld, and he was returned to institutional care. The staff described him as polite, cooperative, easy to get along with. Many who worked with him said that if they had not known who he was, they would never have suspected anything was wrong. Not the monster people expected to find. Just a quiet, harmless-seeming old man with nowhere else to be. Ed Gein died on July 26, 1984. 77 years old. Respiratory failure. He was buried in the Plainfield cemetery, the same cemetery he had visited at night with tools. Decades later, pieces of his gravestone were found chipped away, taken as souvenirs. Even in death, he drew people toward him. Even in death, the story refused to end. Here is something worth sitting on. Ed Gein was not, by the measure of sheer numbers, the most destructive criminal in American history. Not even close. 2 confirmed murders, an unknown number of grave robberies. By the cold math of harm caused, many other criminals had done far worse. And yet his name is the one that endured. His case is the one that psychiatrists and criminologists are still studying decades after his death. His story is the one that keeps showing up in films and novels and late-night conversations about what human beings are capable of. The reason is not what he did, it is why. The picture that emerged from years of psychological analysis was one of almost total psychological collapse following his mother's death. Augusta Gein had, over the course of Ed's entire childhood and adolescence, shaped every belief he held about the world. Every value, every boundary, every understanding of what was acceptable and what was not. And she had done so while systematically cutting him off from any other source of human connection or grounding. When she died, there was nothing left to hold Ed Gein to the reality that everyone else around him inhabited. The isolation she had created became total, and in that total isolation, something gave way. His behavior after her death was not random. It was not the expression of cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was, in the most disturbing possible way, an attempt to hold on, to reverse something that could not be reversed, to find a way back to the only person who had ever mattered to him. That does not make what he did understandable. It does not make it forgivable, but it makes it something perhaps more unsettling than simple evil. It makes it human. Recognizably, terrifyingly human. A grief so consuming and so distorted that it bent entirely out of shape and became something that no one who saw the inside of that farmhouse would ever forget. When the full story of Ed Gein became public, it spread across the country like a cold front. People talked about it in diners and barbershops and living rooms, and then in hushed voices late at night. It lodged itself in the American imagination, and it refused to leave. Not long after, it began showing up in other places. In 1959, writer Robert Bloch published a novel called Psycho. His main character, a quiet, troubled young man living under the shadow of a domineering mother, drew directly from the outline of Ed Gein's story. Alfred Hitchcock brought that novel to the screen, and Norman Bates became one of the most iconic villains ever created. In 1991, Thomas Harris gave the world Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, a killer whose particular obsession drew, once again, from what had been found inside that Wisconsin farmhouse. And then there was the film that brought us here, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, released in 1974. The creative DNA of that film, the isolation, the darkness, and most unmistakably Leatherface in his mask of human skin, came from Plainfield, Wisconsin, from a quiet farmhouse on the edge of town, from a man nobody suspected. Ed Gein never intended to leave anything behind, but the characters he inspired have terrified audiences for more than half a century. And somewhere underneath all of them, if you look carefully enough, is the same quiet, ordinary-seeming man, standing in a darkened farmhouse in Wisconsin. The story of Ed Gein is disturbing for many reasons. The things that were found, the years they went undetected, the calm, cooperative manner of the man at the center of it all. But perhaps the most disturbing thing about the story is the simplest one. He lived in a small town. He was known. He was recognized on the street. He babysat children. He told bad jokes. He waved to neighbors from across the road. And behind all of that, behind the completely ordinary surface of a quiet rural life, something had been happening for years that no one who knew him could have imagined. That gap between appearance and reality is the thing that has kept this story alive for nearly 70 years. Because it does not just describe a man in Wisconsin in the 1950s, it describes something about the nature of darkness itself, how it does not always announce itself with a raised voice or a threatening look, how it does not always wear a face you would recognize as dangerous, how it can live quietly inside an ordinary life, waving from a front porch, telling a bad joke at the feed store, looking like nothing at all. Now, before you go, in the next video, we are going to take the story one step further. We are going to look at the true story behind the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. How much of that film was actually rooted in real events, what Tobe Hooper drew from, what he invented, and what the connection between that film and Ed Gein really reveals about the way horror works, about why we are drawn to these stories, about what they are really doing to us when we watch them in the dark. That video is coming very soon. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. And before you go, leave a comment and answer this question. Should this channel feature more deep dives into real cases like this one? There are many more stories waiting to be told. Some of them are even stranger than this one. Some of them are even harder to believe. And every single one of them is true. I will see you in the next one.